Welcome to Imagine Nation and to our Think and Drink tonight on criminal justice reform. My name is Sam Dwyer. I work for Humanities Montana. We are a statewide nonprofit that does programs in the humanities. Our mission is to serve communities through stories and conversation. We provide experiences that nurture imagination and ideas through Montanans' diverse histories, literature, and philosophies. Think and Drink programs are an especially fun way to have humanities experiences. I want to let you know from the beginning that this is not a debate, that we're not trying to find consensus or convince anyone. We are here to listen to viewpoints that are different from our own and to have a provocative conversation. This will be a panel, and so you will hear a conversation up here at the front, but you will also have some time to have conversation amongst yourselves. We'll take about a 15-minute break in the middle to do some table talk, and you have some prompts on your table, some questions to respond to. That'll be a chance to grab another beer, use the restroom, and kind of check in with each other and kind of digest some of this information that you'll receive. And then we'll come back and do a second session with the panelists, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. We'll wrap up at 7:30. The brewery closes at 8, so you'll have a little bit of time again to kind of digest the information and then get out the door in time for these guys to close up. There will be table service, so if you need a beer while the panel is going on, you can raise your hand and flag the bartenders, and they'll come over and take care of you. If you are here just to drink and have conversation that is not about criminal justice reform, the center is open in the back, and you can head on back there for a little quiet space. With that, thank you so much again for being here tonight. We're really excited to see this crowd. We're also live streaming on Facebook, so thank you to anyone who's joining us over the airwaves. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Danny Tenenbaum, who's going to moderate our panel tonight.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. This is going to be an excellent panel. I'm 100% sure of it. A little bit about myself. I'm just a public defender here in Missoula, and I used to be a public defender for Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes before that. And I guess I'll just start off by introducing briefly our wonderful panelists. First, right next to me is David Hurst, who is the Montana Director of Americans for Prosperity, which works on issues of taxation, regulatory reform, and also criminal justice reform. And next to David is Ellie Hill, who is Missoula legend, attorney, activist, state legislator. You all probably know her. And next to Ellie is S.K. Rossi, who is the policy director for the ACLU of Montana. And next to Rossi is Malin Smith, who currently works in the tribal prosecutor's office for the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes, and before that was the director of the Indian Law Clinic at the University of Montana. And also was serving as an appellate justice on several tribal courts. So, the topic tonight is the past, present, and future of criminal justice reform in Montana. That's quite a big issue. So, my question, and I guess I'll start with Malin, is how do you define criminal justice reform today?
So, of course, I'm going to take it off the wheels off the bus immediately because I think criminal justice reform, I don't want to do it too loud, okay? Criminal justice reform is a bit of a misnomer that we need justice reform to do criminal justice reform, and it starts well before you get into the criminal system if you're going to go there. So for me, criminal justice reform is looking at those factors that get people into the criminal justice system ultimately, and that can be poverty issues, housing issues, educational system, it can be dependency, neglect, it can be mental health issues, co-occurring issues. And those are the factors that you see have been not addressed by the time they often get into the criminal system. So addressing those factors early on with preventive services is what I view as criminal justice reform ultimately.
So that being said, with the criminal justice system as it exists, criminal courts, I would say beginning with police, criminal courts, the prison system, probation, parole, reentry, along that sort of spectrum, what would you say is the most pressing issue for reform that's needed?
Keeping them out of the system to begin with.
Okay.
So if you keep them out of the system through preventive services, doing a more holistic, what I refer to as the holistic approach to that, and looking at what those needs are, which are often co-occurring mental health needs.
In the work as a prosecutor, what does that mean for you in your office? How do you do things differently?
So we do probably a fair number of deferred prosecutions, where we don't prosecute at all. We identify services that they need and provide those services. It also is looking at getting them in to do mental health screenings, chemical dependence screenings to determine what needs they have and trying to address those without having to be detained.
And Ellie, I'm going to move on to you.
Hello? It's sure you're registered to vote.
Ellie, I'm just going to start very broadly. What is wrong with our criminal justice system?
Oh, that's an easy one. So what is wrong with our criminal justice system? First and foremost is the criminalization of poverty, right? That's exactly what's wrong with our criminal justice system. We have a tradition in the Montana legislature. I've been there since 2011, so under two governors, under Brian Schweitzer and under Steve Bullock, and they've done it for years and years and years before I got there. And there's a caucus of folks in the Montana legislature, and you can say it with us. We say the Pledge of Allegiance, and at the end of it, we say, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And then we all say, someday, right? Because we're not there yet. And we say that every single day. And that's because the criminalization of poverty is what's wrong with our criminal justice system. Our jails in Montana, the state of Montana, have become a revolving door of two types of folks, and that's the mentally ill and the homeless. So our jails have become mental hospitals and homeless shelters. All the statistics bear that out, right? It is absolutely marginalized populations. Mental illness, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, so we call that in the field co-occurring disorders, right? Mental illness with substance abuse. We also have generational poverty. So Malin talked a little bit about DN cases. That's an acronym for dependent neglect, which are youth in need of care. That's what you're hearing about all over right now in the news, is the number of kids and families that are being removed from their parents and put into foster care or with kin or with family. And generally that removal, right, is a system of our poverty and of drug addiction. And in Montana, of course, methamphetamine addiction. So what's wrong with our criminal justice system, I think as Malin very well pointed out, is holistic and complex, but for the most part involves systems of the home and family and poverty.
So you mentioned the dependency and neglect cases and generally the child welfare system. Do you see the need for reform limited to the causes of people getting involved, people being having their children taken away, or do you see the system itself, the way that, say, children are taken from their?
So of course, it's difficult for me not to take my political hat, but you know, our values are what we spend our money on in the Montana legislature right now. At least the majority party does not value abused and neglected children. Otherwise, they would fund the systems that take care of abused and neglected system, right? So when we have the underfunding of the attorneys, the Office of Public Defender, which handles, I dare say, 99% of all of the moms and the dads and the little kids that are removed in those, all of them, they handle the mom and the dad and the kids are all appointed by the Public Defender's Office. So that's an underfunded system. But The more tragic underfunding of the system, right, is the Department of Public Health and Human Services, Child and Family Services Division. And so when you don't have enough caseworkers to take care of the kids, they have to go in and make sure. That's why you have the kids that die, like the little boy in Great Falls, right? And then when the kids are removed, it takes a hell of a long time to get the judges to get them reunified or put into a placement where they can be with kin or be unified. And then the other issue, right, is that there's no place to get the drug addiction and the halfway houses and the sober living environments to reunify the kids anyway, because we haven't put any funding into those types of programs. So vote for your values if you care about issues, because that is really how they're funded and that's how we solve the problem.
David, I'm going to pass the question on to you. What do you see as the most pressing need for reform in the criminal justice system in Montana?
Yeah, so the way we look at it is you have on-ramps. The driver's license bill from last session was an on-ramp where you undermine someone's ability to keep and maintain a job because of the bill. You basically create an on-ramp for them to drive without a license because you've taken the license away.
Do you want to tell the folks here about that bill?
Sure. So what the bill did is, in Montana, if you were late on a court-filing fee, the judge could yank your license. Now, 75% of the people that happen to continue to drive because you got to go to work, right? Or you got to drop your kids off at daycare or get them to school or whatever. Life goes on. So what we wanted to do is we repealed that, allowed the judge to basically took away the judge's power to do that. Now they can still enforce the fine or fee. They just have to do so through alternate means. Of course, the court had a good argument, right? It was we need the incentive, but that incentive structure can happen by dialogue. It can happen a lot of other ways, from food donations to community service, things like that. So in the discussion, what we wanted to do, and the best way that we approached it, as someone who's more understood as center right, was what we want is a free society where the bottom do as well as they absolutely can. And this is one way in which government, if you're right winger, you're thinking government can be the problem. This is one way in which government is keeping people out of the free market, out of employment, and on arbitrary basis. Creating the on-ramp to criminalization is the first step, right? And trying to eliminate those on-ramps so that we only put people in prison who are a danger to the community. That's the first start of the safety standard. Next is its cost. We spend quite a bit of money on criminal justice, $800 billion in the United States, so $700 million here in Montana. And we have a significant amount of the budget, and it's a large government program. Like any large government program, there are inefficiencies and places like that we need to look at, make sure that our tax dollars are being spent wisely. And then next, lastly, we want reentry, so that, or of course, due process, good due process, and then reentry. So right now, there are significant barriers for reentry and employment when you come out of prison. We believe in human dignity. We don't think that someone's worst day should define the rest of their life in perpetuity. What we want is for if you serve your time, you get out. Oh, got quiet. If you serve your time and you get out, that you should be able to get a job. You get the dignity that goes with the job and provide for yourself. And those sorts of things, those barriers that government creates, we want to lower those and create the most amount of opportunity, especially for those who are least more often.
Do you think it's possible to work on those reentry issues and find solutions to these obstacles for people who are reentering society without funding government programs and without, doesn't it require money?
So yeah, our first priority is where is government creating barriers and lowering those? Because right now that's where the most amount of policy agreement is, right? So where we can find and create coalitions to build that sort of thing, that's what we want. And then number two, where are the other barriers? For example, what's the diagnosis, right? I'm from Bozeman, so don't hold that against me. Right? But in Bozeman, we have a serious housing crisis. And I'm sure people in Missoula can sympathize with that. You're also a college town. Why does that exist? So from our perspective, our point of view of why the housing crisis exists, why people can't keep in their home, pay for rent, or pay for their mortgage, there's a couple layers. One of it is zoning laws, right? Over-regulatory, over-robust, and over-planned zoning laws constrict supply. And when you constrict supply, that increases prices as there's more demand to live here. Because it's awesome living here. I want to live here. We all want to live here. So there's a lot of demand. So how do you do that? You have to loosen up those zoning laws. There's a very bottom up. There's not a state level problem. It's a county level problem. We would rather see those lower because every time you create a transfer program, every time you create another government program meant to help people in that situation, you are moving money and not creating more abundance. You're not solving the underlying problem. And that's what we want to do is create the communities and the coalitions that solve problems for the most amount of people, especially people at the bottom.
Now, I want to go back to something you said before. You were talking about the driver's license suspension bill. And this is something I'd like you and Rossi to talk about because I know you both worked on this bill. What was that generally like to work on this bill that I think it required bipartisan support? It was sort of unique in a session that I don't think saw a lot of bipartisan work except for a couple few select issues.
Well, almost, I mean, in my experience in Montana legislature was not nearly as much as these do. Almost everything happens on some kind of bipartisan level just because of the nature of it. We might have a Republican majority, but nothing gets done by a Republican majority because the Republicans all hate each other. And I know the Democrats are not even fighting with you guys too. So there's always some kind of coalition being built. There's always a triangulation happening at the time. So in this case, Rossi and I got together the summer before, and we said, let's do some awesome stuff and blow up the session, right? And one of the things that immediately happened is we had an event, and we were going to do the AFP, ACLU, criminal justice reform, Capitol briefing, right? And we pulled together, and not a single one of the people that I usually work with showed up. It was moderate Republicans who don't like me because of Medicaid expansion, and Democrats who love the ACLU and don't like me very much. So that I've been criticizing on economic freedom stuff, for that time, and that's okay. That's just a disagreement in politics. That's what we do. And so we got together and we had this discussion, and it was awesome, and it opened plenty of doors. In fact, as we went throughout that session, I got connected to so many Democrats who I didn't know I had so much in common with. It was an amazing process discovering that we're all Montanans together. We all have things that we can agree on. And at one point I actually got lost in the minorities, the minority offices and I tried to find someone there because I didn't know what it is. So I had to text Rossi and figure out where it was so I could get to where I need to talk to. And that's because in my career, for the most part, I spent my time talking to Republicans. That place where we got to get together across partisan lines was a really amazing moment. And something that we want to build on for criminal justice reform in the future. And I'm talking way too much, so let's get it, please.
Rossi, we want to hear your input. We want to hear this from your perspective.
First of all, I'm beloved by many Republicans. not just Democrats. It was actually a really fun bill to work on, but it was super fun working with David. I think I was probably in communication with David more than anybody else during that legislative session. But really it came down to what I think is one of the most important points to make about what we call criminal justice reform is that it's a really interesting cross-section of values.
Yes.
So, whether or not you care about it from a human rights perspective, whether or not you care about it from an economic justice perspective, whether or not you care about it from a fiscal responsibility perspective, whether or not you care about it from a workforce development perspective, there's something for everybody in the fight to end the criminalization of poverty specifically, and also the enormous glut that exists in how much money we spend on enforcement of stupid criminal laws and detaining and imprisoning people for breaking those laws. So when we approached this bill, we approached it that way. I mean, ironically, we had a press conference at the beginning of the session, and I got up and was like, people need to go to work. People need jobs. You gotta, leave them alone, liberty. And David got up and was talking about, racial disparities and economic disparities in the criminal justice system. Great. And it, kind of went over like a lead balloon at first. I mean, I think people were mostly put off by our partnership, to be quite honest. I think people lost a little bit of trust in David because he was working with the ACLU, and I definitely had some conversations with Democrats who were angry that the ACLU was working with AFP. But at the end of the day, we agreed on an issue, and why not move it forward and let go of your, preconceived notions of what people value. And that's how that bill got through. I mean, it also took some pretty drastic procedural maneuvering. I'm not going to be dishonest about that. But we had the votes because people understood the issue, and they understood it from their own values perspective, not because we were trying to convince them of a different one. But I think that's a common theme in quote unquote criminal justice reform, which I prefer to call public safety.
And that was the previous session. Now we're coming up on the next latest legislative session. It's still a year away. But that being said, we don't know who the governor is going to be. We don't know what the makeup of the legislature is. What issues do you think are going to be on the table in 2021 that could change public safety, change the criminal justice system in Montana?
You're talking to me?
Yeah, I'm talking to everyone.
Well, I kind of feel like everything's on the table right now. David and I have been working very hard to bring diverse voices to the table to start talking about essentially reframing criminal justice reform as advocating for public safety instead of against the criminal justice system. And we're doing it in a way that I think will lead to very creative policy proposals. I mean, part of the issue is that, they had this legislative week, a few weeks ago. No one really understood the point of it. Regardless, they had this legislative week, and one of the events during that week was a breakout session on public safety. And the point of it, as far as I could tell, was for legislators to sit around the table and complain about how much money is spent on justice programs. So there was a lot of talk about how, when the public defender has to get extra money outside of their budget, or the courts need extra money outside of their budget, that takes away from education, that takes away from healthcare, whatever it is. But the budget isn't a zero-sum game, first of all. There is a theory that's very effective called divestment and reinvestment. So maybe stop spending so much money on cops and spend more money on mental health care. Regardless, that whole conversation was about money. And I was starting to get really agitated, which I frequently do while sitting in committees listening to legislators talk for a very long time, often inanely, about things they don't really understand very well. No offense to the legislators in the room. But I was starting to get really agitated.
She doesn't mean me.
No, well, I definitely do. So I started to get really agitated, and I didn't really know what I was going to say when I got up there, but what I said is something that David and I have been talking about for months, which is you need to start rethinking what public safety means. If you're saying, you can't ask the question, do you feel safe in your community? Because then people are automatically going to think about, do they see enough police in their community? That's the only thing people are going to think of. So what we need to start asking each other is, what makes you feel safe as a person? And if you start asking it that way, people are going to say, my family. People are going to say my house. People are going to say being able to get to work in the morning, having work to go to. That is what makes people feel secure. And that's how we need to start thinking about public safety, because when you shove someone into the criminal justice system, they're going to lose their family. They're going to lose their house. They're going to lose their job. They're going to lose every single thing that makes them feel safe. And when they finally get back out, it's not going to be there waiting for them. It is gone. So essentially, we are taking people out of the only safe spaces they have, regardless of how little of it they have, and forcing them into a system that is completely demolishing anything that makes them feel remotely safe or comfortable in the world. So I think what we have to start thinking about for public safety reasons in the next legislative session is how to increase that safety for people, how to increase their access to the services they need, how to make sure they're not stuck in jail for 7 months on average per person in Montana before they even get to trial because they can't afford their $500 bail. We have to start thinking about how people can access employment when they get out of prison instead of struggling to find jobs because they're not allowed to get licensed in the state of Montana because they have a criminal record. So we have to start thinking about public safety on the front end and when people are coming back into their communities instead of just thinking about police, prisons, and courts, because those are the three systems that put people out of safety. Don't bring people into it.
Just to dovetail on what Rossi said, some low-hanging fruit, I think, for next session where we can find bipartisan support are things like adding cash bond in Montana. Other states have been doing it. Does everyone in this room know that all 56 counties in Montana, the county jails contract with a Houston, Texas company called Securus? And when low income or anyone, if you got arrested, it would cost somewhere, depending on the county, between $3 and $6 a minute to make a phone call. So the industrialization of our prison system is alive and well here in the state of Montana. That's an easy thing that often has bipartisan support. I think in 2015, we were able to allow these folks to call their lawyer for free. A way we can get money that I'm pretty excited about for next legislative session will be on the ballot this November, and that's recreational marijuana. That will be on the ballot with a 20% tax, and I think that there'll be some new funding sources there that seems to, there's been some polling from the National Marijuana Policy Project as well as the National ACLU, and it's looking in about 54 or 56 counties where it has a passage rate here in Montana. By the way, just so you know, we call it adult use, not recreational marijuana. Of course, there's 13 states now that have it, and they mostly surround Montana as well as Canada. So that will be a great funding source where we can get access to some of the stuff, these programs that we want to do. We still need to end the death penalty in Montana. I wanted to say there's Scott Crichton, who was the longtime head of ACLU, and Amos Singleton, the new head of the Montana Innocence Project. So if we're going to talk about the past, future, and present, there's two stalwarts right there, and everyone appreciates your work.
So along those lines, I think one of the, when you're talking about financial responsibility, the cost for treatment is going to be far less than the cost of incarceration. And most of these, if we had treatment that was readily available like immediately, that would reduce a lot of the people that end up in the system and that have to bond out now. I'm all with you on getting right done. We don't need bond. That's not a safety issue. It's a punitive issue. So addressing through not only readily available, but looking at the various step-down programs in your treatment systems, and also looking at what I, for me, is the culturally appropriate treatment programs, particularly for Indian country, and then looking at how we can address the disproportionate representation of Indian people in the system as well, and eliminating some of those implicit biases.
I have a little bit on that. So one of this is a strategic question. So we don't know who the governor is. We have a sense of what the legislature is, but there's a tremendous amount of churn in the legislature because of term limits, right? So what we have to do is we have to boil those down to what we think will pass, kind of regardless of which party the governor is in, and what the makeup of the legislature is ideologically, not necessarily bipartisan. So what that looks like to me, at least in part, is exonerate compensation being a major part of that. Mostly because it's the way that we can best teach people who are skeptical of our point of view. So, for example, in Montana, if you are falsely accused of a crime and go to jail for it, and then you are exonerated, we pretty much say, hey, you can go to college here. That's it. And you're like, you stole their 20s from them, and you're like, the best thing we could do is give you some college. It's a completely inappropriate, unjust system that if we take someone's property, for example, we have rules around that. We say we have to fairly compensate them for that. When we take their liberty from them, we give them nothing. It's a sort of argument that you can make to that center-right legislator who's open to the idea but doesn't understand the what's going on in the CJR space, in the public safety space. So exonerate compensation, one of those justice baseline ideas, and it's a liability issue. We can limit the state's liability by defining in statute what that award is if you get that if you're falsely put in prison. And then next, I think bail bond, there is more consensus on it than you might imagine, and I think there's a lot of room to be worked there. And then I think in the reentry space, and licensure especially, there's a lot of work that can be done to educate, especially the right, about how to about the fact. Okay, just the statistics sell themselves. Almost everyone who goes to prison comes out of prison. And when they come out of prison, you want them to be contributors to society, right? So once you get that dialogue going, you can open up to more spaces and talk about other sorts of things. I think there's a lot to do in especially the Innocence Project's the leader in this space, but within the justice space when it comes to evidentiary standards, when it comes to jailhouse witnesses and things like that, there's a lot of things to do in due process to make the system a more, not a fair system by the liberal term of fairness is, justice is fairness, but by the conservative definition of justice, which is just desserts, right? And not everyone agrees with that matrix, but from their point of view, we have a very bad system, and we need to make that argument to them and help them see how our system is not serving their view of justice. And if we do that, I think we can go on to much more. Figure out.
Yeah, and I would just add, it's been really interesting. So I know we're not talking about the Child Protective Services system tonight, so I'm not going to go into depth into it. I barely understand it as it is. Regardless, I've been having really interesting conversations with Republicans, especially, about the frustration they have with DCF. I don't even know what the acronym is. CDs. Is that what it is, Montana?
CFS, but
There you go, CFS. There are frustrations with CFS, and I've been trying to talk to them about how the frustrations that they have with CFS are based in the same issue that we have with the criminal justice system, which is you start penalizing families and penalizing people for not doing well and not checking the right boxes and being addicted and suffering from mental health disorders. And then the consequences to that are to either go to jail or get your kids taken from you. And it really boils down to, in both of these systems, a lack of services. Like it's a lack of mental health treatment, it's a lack of substance use disorder treatment, and it's a lack of support in finding and succeeding in those services. And that's been a little, not necessarily effective, because I have no idea, because we're not in legislative session, so I don't know if it's going to be effective. But regardless, the same issues cross through all these government systems that are penalty-based systems. And people are being penalized for the same exact things. And it's because they are in unstable situations. And when that lands them in a government system like the criminal justice system or like the child protection or child and family services system, there's nothing for them after that. So they're expected to move mountains to get better and get their kids back, or move mountains and get better and get off probation and parole, but there's no one helping them do that. So peer support, right? And peer support is what? We have like 5 peer support specialists across the state of Montana. It's bananas. Yeah, not enough. It feels like 5. Lori, it feels like 5. Lori's awesome. Regardless, I think there's some connections being made there that something drastic has to happen, or the number of kids in the foster care system and the number of people in our jails is just going to keep going.
I did just want to say this. Sorry. But this is a space where, as somebody who has become jaded and sad often by how partisan the Capitol in Allen is, which was very reflective, of course, what we see in Washington, D.C. right now, it is very partisan, and it often feels like it's difficult to get things done. In the last 2 sessions, criminal justice reform has been a source of great hope for me, joy, resolution. Back in the day when I was the head of the Poverello Center and I first decided to run for the legislature as a sort of a younger lawyer, it was these reasons, these bipartisan reasons that I saw as the POV, right? Faith-based groups, volunteers, academics, Missoulians. That's the kind of folks that were involved there. And that's what I'm seeing now in this movement in Montana. And I mean that with my heart. I really feel like what these folks are talking about in their expertise, we can see real change despite all the roadblocks we see in other areas of the legislature. This is an area where, particularly with your voices, I do also want to say this. As you can see by the two,
You guys see what I'm talking about?
the 2 bedfellows I have here, she's one of the very best lobbyists. They both are, honest to God. The bedfellows we have here is, it's not that there aren't still people on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and, I'm sorry to say, Democrats as well, that are not great on this issue for a variety of reasons. Often related to, a lot of support for law enforcement issues and feeling like that the pie somehow would mean money would get cut in a different way. I'll give you an example. There was a bill a session or 2 ago where they wanted to raise money for the police academy because there wasn't enough money for anything. Well, of course we all want money for the police academy. Who doesn't? I do. We all do. And so they proposed doing that by raising fines and fees in our lower court systems. Our lower court systems, of course, are our justice courts, our city courts, and they're largely our most impoverished folks, right? They're people that get DUIs or DWPs, doesn't even driving while poor. Driving while poor, I call it. What's the real? Driving. Anyway, yeah, driving while suspended. Sorry. Sorry. And so raising fines and fees in our lower courts, right? So we're going to raise money for an essential service. We all need the police academy. from a subset of our lower income. And that bill was very heavily supported by some of my own colleagues on both the right and the left. Now, I'm not going to name who they are because some of them were even Missoula legislators, right? And I remember Anna Curtis and I stood up and we lost our heads about it. So these are deeply personal issues that affect us all and that we all need to pay attention to. So just make sure you know who you're voting for.
And with that, I'm going to interrupt you guys for just a second. This is awesome. And we're going to come back and do some more of this. But I want to give everyone about 15 minutes to kind of digest some of the information and talk to each other. You have on your table, there are some of these little scattered pieces of paper that say table talk. And there are 2 questions on here, some prompts for you to kind of get into a conversation with each other for about 15 minutes. And I know I would focus here on the second one. What new information have you learned from the panelists so far? I feel like these guys are brilliant and I'm learning so much sitting up here. So we'll take about 15 minutes. You can refill your drink and digest this information and talk amongst yourselves for a bit, and then we will come back and have a second session with more questions for the panelists. Thanks, Scotty.
Yeah, I just didn't want you to like think that you didn't have to.
Where will that line of the submissions are? How are you? Good, how are you? You too. Okay, so how about when we come back and
I'm like trying to find it over. Okay.
I'm good.
Coming in clear. We're gonna go to Fred. Yes. I said, my children are very accustomed to breweries and very accustomed to getting the market. They don't like it, but they're trying to watch the job. And the job description. We're going to raise some water. That's just the way it was. Those are like community gathering spots. They're growing up no differently
I hope you guys have a great conversation with the new friends we just met here. We're going to come back and we're going to do the second half of this program just as Q&A with the audience. We're going to start with an audience question from our Facebook audience, and then we're going to walk around with the mic. So if you have a question that you want to ask our panelists, you can just raise your hand and we'll get the mic out to you. But first, our Facebook question.
All right, so this is from Kirsten Tynan, and the question is, it was reported a few days ago that the Georgia governor wants to slash the public defender budget when the prosecution to defender budget is already heavily skewed in favor of prosecution/conviction. Can someone talk about the state of the resource balance between prosecutors versus public defenders in our state, and how are we doing in that regard?
I was going to say, I will tell you, working in the prosecutor's office, I have a lot more resources than if I'm in a defense office. That's just the nature of how they set it up. You have all the resources as a prosecutor, and you don't have those same resources as a defense. Should they be equal? Absolutely. If you're talking about fundamental justice, you need to have that same quality of resources. So it's already skewed in favor of prosecution. Now, having said that, that also means if you have good prosecutors, I like to think that those good prosecutors can make the reforms quicker than if you're trying to do it from the defense side.
I know there are ways, especially, once again, the Innocence Project does an amazing job in this area, to rebalance that, especially when it comes to evidentiary standard. Jailhouse witnesses is a great example. So jailhouse witnesses, if Cody Marble, probably everyone knows the Cody Marble story, but I'll recount it for those who don't. Went to jail, juvie, for a low-level drug offense, possession of marijuana, something like that. In jail, he was accused by a fellow inmate of rape. So two inmates got together and said, we're going to commute our sentences by testifying that Cody Rick. Cody's defense in that trial was never told that the two witnesses got an incentive for testifying against him with commuted sentences. Now, there's lots of bad things about that, right? Tons of money was spent incarcerating someone who was innocent and later was found to be innocent. Tons of time was spent on that, and the defense never had the tools to defend themselves. So, I mean, resources are a concern, but just the balance of the rules themselves can sometimes be in the benefit of the prosecution and keep the defense in the dark, and that's a real problem. Lastly, and I want to draw this back around public safety because that's the number one concern everyone has in this space. The person who accused Cody of rape was in for murder and had his sentence reduced to manslaughter, and then went out into the public and then died in a police shootout while Cody was there on a non-violent offense. There's something really broken about a system that does that, and at least a part of that is rebalancing those rules so that the defense has the tools that they need to do their job.
So Scott Creighton, who's the former head of ACLU, he's one of the biggest experts in the state on the underfunding of our public defender system, which is a reflection again of the criminalization of poverty. When you know what stands outside the United States Supreme Court, right? Our Lady Justice, and she's blind, and she has the scales, right? They're supposed to be even, but in the state of Montana, they are very much not even, right? And that's because the Public Defender's Office, which is the very constitutionally protected lawyer for the impoverished and indigent Montana, which, by the way, has anyone ever looked at a district court calendar? So if you go and look at our district court, and our district court, of course, is in the Missoula County Courthouse, and we have 5 district court judges, and they're all elected. Okay, and our county attorney is elected, and our county sheriff is an elected official. And so in Missoula, it's actually a pretty great system, right? Because these are all folks that are elected, and they, for the most part, share my values without making a partisan comment, right? I always tell people, don't commit a crime in Valley County, right? It's a very different system of government over there. Their values are different, how they treat people in detention is different, all of it's different. So again, not to be partisan, but this is all reflective of the system as a whole.
Yeah, that's fair. I think in terms of resourcing in Montana, when you're talking about prosecutors versus public defenders, they're resourced separately. So when you're talking about law enforcement, including prosecutors, you're talking about the Department of Justice. When you're talking about public defenders, the public defender budget is just a thing in and of itself. And I don't know enough about it to go into detail. I don't want to be upfront about that. But what I do know is that there is not a fight every single legislative session about funding prosecutors adequately. There is always a fight every legislative session about funding public defenders adequately because there's consistently an effort to defund the public defender system or shut that cost onto the counties, which would be even worse than it is now at the state level. So every session, there's this fight over public defender funding. It goes up and down, and the governor puts it at one amount in his budget, and then people who are opposed to funding the public defender at its current levels chip away at it throughout the legislative session. It always ends up lower than it's supposed to be. And the response to that is then later, the next session, they have to do a supplemental funding, which is, I won't go into it, but they have to ask for extra money because they don't have enough resources to serve the number of people in the public defender system. But what ends up happening, through no fault of the public defender's fault, is that then they have to figure out a way to operate inside the budget that they have. They don't have unlimited resources. So then they end up making it harder to become eligible to get a public defender. You have to fill out all these forms and find all this financial information and send all this information to the public defender's office to even qualify to get one. And I couldn't do it. I would just be like, fuck it, I'm going to jail. Like the amount of information you have to submit to even get a public defender is bonkers. So they make it harder to become eligible. They cut contract services, so they can't actually. They actually have to contract out a lot of their work because they don't have enough staff in the public defender office. So they have to contract with private defense attorneys. And no offense to private defense attorneys, but a lot of them run up their tabs and take money from the public defender's office and aren't actually doing a ton of work. So like they're actually really screwed in most states, including Montana. So their funding actually needs to go way, way up. Or we have to do what we've all been talking about and reduce the number of people who are actually in the public defender in the first place through ending the criminalization of poverty.
Totally building off of what Rossi just said, I think there is a lot of attention paid to the salaries of public defenders like myself versus the salaries of prosecutors. And I think there are definitely some places where the disparity is troubling. I don't know if that's the first issue I would pinpoint in Montana, specifically because public defenders in Montana are employees of a state agency. So they're paid pretty much the same across the state, whether you're in Havre or whether you're, in Thompson Falls or something, or in Billings or in Missoula. Versus county attorneys, prosecutors, they're paid at the county level. They're county employees, and so some counties pay their prosecutors better, some pay them worse. So there's some places where public defenders do make more than prosecutors, and there's other places where that's not the case. But going off of what Rossi said about addressing the disparities in funding as it relates to people before they actually enter the system, that's where what really jumps out to me. And you'll see this in progressive cities across Montana where they're still hiring large numbers of police to increase the size of the police forces, where they're wanting to expand the size of their jail so that they can keep more people in cages, incarcerate more people so that they can handle, increases in cases being filed and things like that. And these sort of expenditures, they largely just go off, they're largely implemented without any real critique. It's not like the state legislature where, every dollar that the public defender budget is debated endlessly. If you're a mayor in Bozeman or Missoula and you want to hire 6 more cops, you're not going to really face any backlash for that. And
Literally just happened in Missoula.
really, and I don't think there's anyone, or I don't think there is enough grassroots discussion about what if we hired 6 social workers instead? What if we spent that money on affordable housing instead? Like, what if that was set aside for that? Or what if that was set up for more addiction treatment? Things like that. That's the disparity in resources that I really see in terms of how it could have a much larger effect. Because then you wouldn't really need to hire public defenders like myself, or as many public defenders as myself. If you reduce it on the front end, that's really where I see the disparity personally. I'm not on the panel, I'm just a moderator. That's what I see as
You're not just a moderator.
So as I was walking through the audience, someone asked a question. Someone told me a question that I thought was really good. I don't know if they're going to ask it themselves, so I'm just going to ask it for them. And we're talking a lot about problems in the criminal justice system. What is something that you think is going right in the criminal justice system?
Treatment courts. Treatment courts are awesome. We have a tribal court, that's the treatment court, and I think it was some state funding for that, where we have a tribal attorney assigned so that it represents the socioeconomic differences that recognize some limitations, particularly to get housing. So we have a lot of homeless folks here, but if we can get them back into their own communities where they're near family and near resources, that's a lot better situation. Having support around us is good for all of us. Tribal courts, we have a co-occurring court here, and they have them around the state. There's 2 women judges in Billings that are doing some innovative stuff with some treatment courts involving DN cases. I love electing women judges. And so I'm a big fan of these alternative court systems that, again, take often county grant writing and state partnerships, but those are really, we're seeing a lot of successes with those. There's a veterans court here in
I actually think there are some positive developments in the criminal justice system, which I, don't actually talk about enough. That's fair. Regardless, I think there's I'm sure a lot of you have seen that there's an uptick in high-profile races for county attorney across the country, where people who are running on anti-incarceration platforms are winning their races and pledging to do things like stop prosecuting marijuana offenses, and cash bail, do all these things that they know will actually decrease their jail populations and increase public safety. So I think the uptick in people running for public office that can actually influence immediately criminal justice policy is a really interesting development. There are a lot of good folks involved in the criminal justice system here in Missoula and across the state who are super invested in the system being better. Judge Landy Holloway's back here, and when we worked together on the criminal justice something for Missoula that I can't remember the name
What's
of.
it called, Rossi?
What?
What's it called?
I don't, CJCC, that's an acronym, I don't know, the CJCC, but regardless, we worked together on there and I know that she's invested in it and there are other folks in Missoula who are working really hard, including Krista and Laurel back here who are working super hard to make sure that the Missoula system itself is getting better. So there's investment and the ideology is there, but it's really hard to figure out how to make it work, but there are people trying. There was one other thing I was going to say that was a positive. Now I can't remember what it was. Oh, prosecutorial integrity units are also popping up across the country. I think that is something we should have in Montana. I hope to see someone start talking about that at the legislative level. My sister actually has one of those up in a pretty large city, and she's already,
What does that mean?
It means there's a independent office in a county attorney's office that is responsible for ensuring that prosecutors are doing their jobs with integrity, doing their jobs ethically, and then reviewing decisions that have been flagged as somewhat unethical or lacking integrity and pulling them backwards. So those are, I think, really important things to have. There has to be independent oversight of the courts, prosecutors, and police, and currently there is none of that in Montana. So.
I think one other thing that we can mention is the momentum that criminal justice reform has right now is actually tremendous. So to tell the story, we kind of jumped in the middle of the story in a lot of ways. With criminal justice reform across the kind of the southern Iowa Belt, Texas, into Oklahoma, Ohio, that area, there was pretty much a bankruptcy going on in the prisons, pretty much bankrupting the state budgets. Suddenly there was a big pressure from those very red states to start looking at and trying to address the spending that was going on in the criminal justice system. And as they looked at it, they found lots of other things that were obviously contributing to crime in the first place that they could cut off. And then, all the things that we've been discussing tonight suddenly became, palatable to a whole new group of people. As they began criminal justice reform in this, it spread to other states. It spread actually eastward, over to Georgia, Florida, and then up. And then before we know it, we had the First Step Act. The First Step Act was one of the first pieces of legislation in 20 years that have really significantly addressed federal, criminal justice reform, which is still a major driver. Now we're talking about what's going on in Montana. Montana has problems, but we're not as bad as some other states. We've got problems. The federal system is much worse, especially in overcriminalization. For example, right now there are 5,000 federal crimes that you could go to jail for. There are 300,000 on top of that were passed by our bureaucracy that carry criminal penalties. That's an overcriminalization problem. Give you an example how vague some of those are. There was a fisherman in California who went to jail over a regulation written to cover oil spills. He was a fisherman. What he did is he put some of his product back in the water. He went to federal prison for it. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done on the federal level too. And also, I'm talking on criminal justice reform on that issue. I know sometimes that we're often taken as the group that doesn't like increased taxes or spending and stuff like that. I'll tell you what, the proper role of government is to provide for our safety and security through, protection of rights. When it comes to public defenders, in Ohio, AFP was on a coalition to increase the budget for the public defender's office. Why? Because justice was served by that. We are on record opposing a surcharge increase and saying, hey, if you guys want to move the surcharge increase into income or property taxes, let's do it. But no one wants to define surcharges. So in Montana, this is crazy. So if you go to the court and they say, oh, hey, on top of your fee, you also have to pay a surcharge. What's a surcharge? What's a tax for going to court? So now on top of your $500 fee, you got a $300 surcharge or $150 surcharge, and all of a sudden it just piles on and on and on. It's one of those criminalization of poverty issues. Who in their right mind would design a system where the courts are tax collector? That's crazy. It's like a roving mob. You have this incentive for them to be able to hook you into their system so they can get funding for themselves. That's crazy. It's a bad incentive. So that's why we have property and income tax requirement, because you should pay for your courts before you go to them. That's the reason why we have general taxation in the West. So anyways. Those things. We got a lot of momentum on those, and I think it's a positive thing.
So one of the things that I'm seeing more and more of is the restorative justice model being used to take people out of the system and to try and address problems in a non-punitive type of manner. So I'm really encouraged by the more and more systems that are using a restorative justice model.
What is that? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say very specifically, something that's going right with the criminal justice system in Montana is the CSKT public defender and prosecutors offices. Like the CSKT public defender's office should be the model for how Montana as a state is operating when it comes to criminal justice. Their holistic defense model reduced their recidivism rates by like 40% over 2 years. It's bananas.
What does that mean, though? Restorative justice.
So restorative justice is trying to, what I view restorative justice is you take the parties and you try and heal the relationships, heal the problems that have been caused by the behavior. And it can be done in a lot of different varieties. So there's traditional, and your tribal communities, your traditional ways are viewed as restorative justice, but that really is what I refer as horizontal justice, is you're not concerned about this adversarial system, you're concerned about the parties getting together and deciding how it should be resolved. So the perfect example of that is an old case where murder between two tribal members, the families got together, decided how it was going to be resolved. And it involved restitution, it involved some payments to the family, and it involved a process for the family who had lost their tribal member, their father in that case, for the other family to assume the responsibility for caring for that family. And everybody was in agreement with that. That's a restorative justice model. No incarceration time, nothing. It led to the Major Crimes Act. You're talking about the criminalization, the federal system. That started the Major Crimes Act. Is the non-tribal communities around did not think that was justice. So that restorative justice model is a system where it really is looking at how you can heal your communities and restore relationships.
What does that look like today in CSKT tribal?
So we still do a lot, not as much, because there has been a lot of influence of the federal government on your tribal court systems because of federal dollars that pays for it. So there is still a lot more than you see in the state system, though, in your tribal systems in regards to that. And that is going to mean that you're going to have people who don't go to jail. It's resolved before it's ever even charged. A lot more deferred prosecutions, a lot more restitution, a lot more let's get them into treatment as opposed to incarcerating them. So I think there is a view that you're trying to help the individual, which will then help the family, which will then help the community.
So we'll go on to the audience questions now.
In the Missoulian today, they had an article on the reduction of violent crime in the state, but that most crime is caused by meth heads. So could you address the specific issue of meth addiction in the criminal justice system, please? Especially on that risk.
Well, so yeah, meth is a huge problem, and I will tell you just today, just this afternoon, in one of my hearings, it was all drug related. We had one of the parents who wanted to go to treatment, but guess what? We have no treatment that we can send a parent to immediately when they ask.
What do you mean, on the state level or?
Anywhere. So definitely not on the reservation, but even off the reservation, there's waiting lists of anywhere from 6 months to a year to get into treatment programs. If you have somebody at that moment that says, I want to do treatment, I want help, and you can't get them for 6 months, by the time that 6 months is there, they're not interested in treatment anymore. And part of the problem with I think all of your addictions is they're self-medicating because of mental health issues and because of the trauma in their communities, and for poverty reasons, they're just numbing themselves. So there's all these issues that impact those drug issues.
So I asked earlier if you looked at a district court calendar here in Missoula or anywhere. I do contract work for the public defender's office, and I can tell you unequivocally 95% probably of an afternoon calendar are at the office of public defender. So that just goes to show you your district court calendar. 95% of them have qualified as indigent. So So an entire afternoon or entire morning, all 5 district court judges in Missoula are indigent. And I'd say half of those are some way related to methamphetamine. In the youth in need of care, which is every judge will do 1 morning a week, Judge Halligan, Judge Marks, Judge Dayshaw, 1 morning a week, those are all youth in need of care. Nearly all of those are methamphetamine. There's Kelly Sather, one of the best county or public defenders. She represents moms and lots of moms, and she can tell you what percentage of meth, Kelly? All of them. The good news though, right, is that, I mean, let's face it, before I started doing DN work, I thought, well gosh, if you took a kid or a bunch of little kids out of somebody's home, right? I mean, they're scared. You see the commercials now where they put their stuff in their pillowcase and they're just taken in the middle of the night. That happens every single day in Missoula, Montana. Whether they're 3 or 5, it's tough work. And they're taken because their parents are addicted to drugs. And what I said, the good news is before I started into this work, I thought if you were taken away, it was because your parents were beating you, right? Like that you were abused. Well, the statute is, yes, abused and neglect, right? So they're eating jelly sandwiches day after day. We had a case in front of Judge Townsend before she retired, where in the rattlesnake in Missoula, Montana, the little boy had lived for 5 months with no power. And the neighbors are the ones who finally called Child and Family Services because he came over because he could smell them cooking pancakes. And he didn't want to tell that he was alone there with no power because he didn't want to get his mom in trouble. So that happens. It happens at Washington School. I have cases. I have cases at Paxson. They're all over, and they're in our communities. And it's methamphetamine for the most part.
Just really quick. So, as a person who has struggled with substance use, calling someone a meth head is the equivalent of calling somebody with alcoholism a wino. So let's just steer clear from calling people meth heads. Everybody's dealing with things around here. Regardless, I think it comes back to the service provision thing. So we've been working with a lot of folks we try to work with formerly incarcerated folks when we're trying to figure out the work we're going to do. And we have this one guy who really wanted to share his story, and he was telling us that he and his partner were both using meth, but stable. They had jobs, they were paying their rent, they're doing okay, but they were both on probation and for meth possession. And but stable. And he went to check in with his probation officer a few times. And his probation officer, and he was failing his urinalysis test. His probation officer kept saying, "Are you using? Are you using?" And he kept saying, "No, I'm not using. I'm not using. It must just be from my people using my house or whatever." And finally, he decided he was going to be honest with his probation officer. He wrote his probation officer a letter and he said, "I need help. I am using. I've been lying to you, but the reason I've been lying to you is because I don't want to come down in jail with no treatment, because that is a terrible thing to have to do." And his probation officer went to court, read the judge the first line that said, "I've been lying, I'm using," and revoked him and sent him back to jail. So part of the issue is, yes, is there a meth issue in Montana? Absolutely. Does drug addiction cause crime? Absolutely. But it's the drug addiction that is the issue. It's not the person that's the issue. So if we can start actually investing in treatment services, if we can make sure that people are getting medically assisted drug treatment while they're in jail or prison, so they're actually being treated for their addiction and not just drying out, which is not addiction treatment. Being sober does not mean you are recovered from your addiction. Then we would start addressing the number of people in our criminal justice system who are addicted to meth, and the number of people who are going back into our communities who are still addicted because they never got appropriate treatment when they were in jail or prison in the first place. So it's a systemic issue itself. I know that we all have some level of choice. We all have free will. We can all control our behavior, but that's not true when you're consistently suffering from mental health issues and substance use disorder. If you're not appropriately treated for it, you're never going to stop suffering from it, and you're never going to stop being addicted. So yes, we have a problem, but the answer is treatment. The answer is not jail and prison. It's a public health issue. It's not a criminal justice issue. So when people are talking about public safety, they should start talking about how to address drug addiction from a public health perspective and stop lumping it in with the criminal justice system.
So where does the money come from in the state for this drug addiction program? So what, as a voter, as a person who backs bills in the legislature as a concerned citizen, what money should we?
So yes, that's unequivocally what we're talking about voting our values, right? That's the frustration session after session, is that when people decide whether they're gonna vote for a Republican or Democrat, right, they're thinking about like guns in schools and abortion and all these things, and the reality is that for the most part, the things that affect their everyday life is how much we fund the Department of Public Health and Human Services, right? How much do you care about these issues? Yeah, the funding, so for example, in Missoula, a lot of our programs are the conduit of money goes to Western Montana Mental Health, and they provide housing, a variety of different housing, right? Everything from youth housing, so if it's a foster child that's maybe aged out of foster home, so they're a teenager and so there's nobody that wants them anymore or whatever, then they can go to the Talbot home or the varying sort of youth homes. There's then if you're an adult, we have the Carol Graham home. There's a variety of different drug treatment programs here in the Missoula area, and for the most part, that funding, there's certainly federal funding that comes. If there's a certain number of tribal members, then they can get access, but then the state funding largely is through the Department of Public Health and Human Services. The POB has some money related through the VA, the Department of Veteran Affairs certainly has some money in there. So it's different pots that sort of create, the whole, it takes a village.
I also want, so this might be why I get along with Republicans. It might be why I would prefer to identify as an independent. I don't know. I actually think there's enough money currently in our government system to pay for the treatment that people need.
Yes.
The problem is that we're investing it in things that don't actually make change. So like Danny was saying, like you've got $600,000 in your budget for the city or the county of Missoula, whoever just hired those police officers. Wonderful. Hire a crisis mobilization or a mobile crisis team to go actually provide social services and treatment to a person who they find, not unresponsive in a park, instead of sending a police officer to go pick that person up and take him to jail. Provide more treatment services with your dollars instead of just funding more enforcement. Like we are upside down on how we think about funding services that will actually lower criminality and recidivism rates.
Services, what department do they work with? That's a great idea.
If you work at this, they could be funded through the state public health department, they could be funded through the county. It doesn't have to be sitting in a department, it could be part of the police department for all I
They
care.
have a little band and that.
Yeah, that's actually
Okay,
been
guys, we've
happening
got
in other
about 10
places.
more minutes, so we're gonna take another question. That's okay, it's easy to get wrapped up in these very important conversations. Brooke, did we have another question?
Does anyone have a question in the audience?
Well, basically, I have to say, what's
the partnership you have with the private sector, like privatization of building more jails or privatization of services? And I've worked many years in the nonprofit sector and provided services that you're talking about. And part of the problem that we've had over the years is funding some of the services that I always call it, the cupcake mentality. We have to have fundraisers, and we bake the cookies, we take them, we sell them, and we buy them back. So I'm not just saying we have to get to the level of having appropriate funding to provide those services. And so I'm just wondering if you have any more comments about the privatization of services.
So privatization services, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but okay, so I'll tell you what one of the things we think. So, yeah, so the most powerful force in our world right now is the private sector, right? It provides all the books, lights, all the stuff in this room is all provided in the private sector, right? The business is private. If you go to North Korea and you drink their beer there, it's not nearly as good as the beer here. Trust me. There's actually a good book about that too, Economists Travel Around Fields. So the utilizing that, where we can utilize the private sector ingenuity and entrepreneurship to solve these problems, I think is a significant component of that. All the problems that really get solved in society, do we have enough shoes? Do we have enough food? Do we have enough whatever? Get solved bottom up by entrepreneurship and people operating a profit loss system. So how we can maximize the things that solve things on a local level, that to us is always the thing that we want to maximize first, because it is the most context local knowledge. It isn't done from on high, imposing by somebody else. So we try to maximize that wherever we can. That's why we advocate for a free market, free economy. But beyond that, when it comes to addiction services, stuff like that, I'd like to tell you about a group called Phoenix. What Phoenix does is they're an investment from our Stand Together community partners that do a tremendous job as a private sector community to solve addiction problems. They have a tremendous success rate. I can't remember the statistics right now, but you should look them up. Just type of Stand Together Phoenix. They do amazing work, and I think if you're wondering what can I do, the best thing you can do is volunteer your extra time and resources to help your neighbor. And looking to Helen to solve all of our problems is not going to solve all of our problems, guys. Looking to the city hall here in Missoula is not going to do that. No matter how good intentional those people are, it's always going to come down to the individual taking responsibility for their own life and extending their goodwill to other people, and allowing that person to work with that person individually first. So that's my point.
Now we're gonna disagree. Let's disagree. Do you want to disagree with me?
Well, I have just a little different take. I like to say nonprofits are a huge resource that we use for services. And so I just think that it doesn't all, it's still a model of providing services other than government services. The nonprofits can be huge, I think, in addressing these problems. So I just want to give that shout out to nonprofits. Even if Missoula wasn't the nonprofit capital.
Rossi, do you want to continue with that?
Yeah. So I am not qualified to help someone recover from addiction. Most churches are not qualified to help people recover from addiction. Most churches aren't qualified to help people recover from poverty or find housing. I mean, the idea that community support is somehow going to solve an enormous mental health and addiction crisis that exists in Montana is preposterous. And while we do have to depend on nonprofits for services, absolutely, we should not in any way be partnering with nonprofits for our criminal justice system. The criminal justice system should be completely funded and adequately funded by government systems. If you're going to put people in jail and you're going to criminalize them, you have to be responsible for them from start to finish. But that includes making sure that they have the services they need. So the government should be responsible for resourcing nonprofits who are providing essential services, but they should not be contracting out probation, imprisonment. They shouldn't be contracting with frickin' Core Civic, CCC, and Shelby. They shouldn't be contracting with a private nonprofit to do their misdemeanor probation in Missoula. It's bananas. That stuff should remain in the government and services, and the people who are qualified to do them. I'm happy to have them funded in the nonprofit sector, and government should provide that funding.
So I just have to tell you, getting government funding though always comes with a lot of strings. And so that isn't always going to mean that the services you can provide are actually what are needed, because then you're providing services the government thinks you need.
Yeah.
So that's tricky.
Yeah.
So it's 7:30 about, and we don't want to go over 7:30. I think all of us are going to be here. We're all going to be sticking around, and we would love to talk about all sorts of issues that relate to criminal justice reform and beyond. And so I just want to thank everyone for coming out here. And there are surveys around that Humanities Montana prepared. You should definitely fill those out. That'll be really helpful. And thank the panelists for coming out and talking about these topics. Thank you so much.
There's also a sign-up sheet for our Humanities Montana newsletter if you would like to receive that. And after you've filled out these surveys, if you could just set them up here at the end of the bar, we'll collect those at the end of the night. Thank you so much.